I do want you to, my relationship with literature is one which actually comes out of simply the kind of relationship that the average reader has with literature, which is that you enjoy reading. And I started off with, I think, a resistance to being, sort of to having to deal with literature from a critical point of view. My sister was an English literature student, and she's my younger sister. So the sibling contradictions were manifest also in the way in which we decided that I certainly was not going to do literature, and B, certainly, I'm going to stick my neck out for history, which I continue to do. But literature actually has been moving in a very interesting way, and one of the things that the new trends have brought to us is that they have actually made possible approaches to literature which actually taken it away from the old fuddy-duddy concerns. And I think, the old thing when you're stuck with Shakespeare and the canonic characters. So actually, I think that it has actually been one of the fields which has opened itself most effectively to feminist approaches and critiques. And the other thing that and that has made it very, very significant. Also, literature is beginning to be more and more historicized. So actually, history and literature have come so much closer to each other. In fact, we are being constantly told by the literature, the real literature wallahs, people like you would kill me, I think, for the way I used women's writing, because I was accused of making it very simplistic. But I was trying to look at it from a historical lens. And I'm sure all of you are certainly locating literature in history. Now, I do also want to point out that women's studies is actually a field, and I've been really enjoying myself both yesterday and today. And right from the beginning, you can see how easily we move from one so-called field to another, and how clear the connections are between one field and the other. That is, day before yesterday, we were talking about, hard political state concerns. Yesterday, we went on to culture and representation, but it's not as if to say these are actually unrelated to each other, and we can see that there are connections that go across all of these fields. And it's a great pleasure, therefore, to be able to sit back and enjoy the presentations of our feminist compatriots, not collaborators, who are, so going to introduce us to the, to developments that are taking place in the field of literature. Without much ado, I shall now proceed to invite Neelam, who was a dear friend, and who's also a very dear friend of a common dear friend. And therefore, there's a double bonus. I knew about Neelam before I actually met her in Sri Lanka. And we went off to see Anuradhapura together, along with Bunny and Amrita Chachi and so on. It was a great trip. So, Neelam, who taught, I don't need to say that to the group here, but for the South Asians, she taught in Kinnaird College for many, many years, and now is full-time with Sumod. And now she will tell you what the paper is about.
I'm going to be talking about the Urdu the popular romantic novel. Technically it should be and I've forgotten her name, the Razia Butt's type of literature. Normally this is the kind of writing which is looked down upon by the serious reader, and that is precisely why I want to look at it, because one of the reasons why these novels are looked down upon is that they are pure fantasy, they are escapist, they have very little to do with reality. But because they are fantasy, I feel it is important to read them from a feminist perspective or a more serious perspective, because fantasy is a very important terrain, and one which until recently has been a fairly neglected terrain, because in the common sense view of things, there is the binary opposition between fantasy as unreal, escapist, whatever, and realism or reality, which is to do with serious matters. And anything that relies solely or very heavily on fantasy has a certain lightweight quality to it. Other than this, the popular romance is pretty lightweight in the sense that the narrative is very thin. Boy meets girl, one or two misunderstandings, they live happily ever after. It is a space of instant fulfillment of desire. There are no impediments, no serious uh, hitches to that fulfillment. And I think that is why the popular romance is popular and so widely read, despite being so reviled and so looked down upon. The reason, but what I do want to look at is, first look at the strategies employed by the popular romance writer in the narrative technique, because if the romance was total fantasy, then even the most escapist or a person desiring escape totally would find it difficult to go on and on reading the same thing. So somewhere the fantasy has to be located in a context. But a tenuous, even if it's a tenuous link, has to be established with reality to give it a bit of credibility. And the credibility comes not out of the story itself, which is, increasingly unreal, but out of what is called the novel's ancillary space. In your English popular romance, I think the worst and most popular forms being the Mills and Boon novels, you have this beautiful girl meeting this surly, rude, apparently the answer to some woman's dream kind of hero. And there's nothing original about their affair. But what gives it credibility or location is the setting. Usually exotic, it can be taken out of some travelogue almost. But there's a lot of detail there. And that detail is usually factually correct because taken out of travelogues or guidebooks or whatever. And the illusion of reality is created in a minimal sense that if all those details are correct, then perhaps what is happening here is also possible. Because the fantasy totally delinked from reality would fail to satisfy. The satisfaction of the popular romance lies in the fact that for a brief moment, it does create a feeling that, okay, this can happen. And if it can happen there, perhaps in my dreams it can happen to me also. Now, I'm going to be looking at the Urdu popular novel, and I'm going to cheat a bit because I did try to read, is it Razia Bhatt? I forgot her name. नहीं, मैंने रज़िया भट्ट की कोशिश की and I couldn't get beyond the first chapter. Because it was all set in this pink bedroom, matching the pink pindleys of this girl who's wearing her legs in the air. She's a model rich girl. So obviously the popular romance is moved with the times also. But then I turned to A.R. Khatun's Afshan. It's a little unfair to equate her with Razia Bhatt because there's a wealth of historical detail and social detail in the spaces around the romance. And I think that is what gives it its richness also. I enjoyed it, and having enjoyed it when I didn't get right down to writing the paper. No, I'm not going to tear it to bits. But the story of Afshan is very simple, or one that we are all very familiar with. But in terms of structure, there is the wider frame, which is the novel's context or ancillary space, where, the family, the house, the outside world, and within it there is another space where the romance happens. And somewhere there is almost no link between the two, except strategic links because people are related to each other. Because what is happening in the romance is, happening or not happening, but the real action is around it. And because it is fairly skillfully written, the love story does depend quite a bit on the surrounding space and the negotiations and maneuverings that are happening there. Now, Afshan, I'll just briefly give you the story, is the story of a young girl whose mother is either dead or mysteriously absent, whose father is also an absent father because he brings the child and dumps it with his parents. She is brought up by her dadi, her dada, and her pupi or her father's sister who is a grass widow. Her husband having abandoned her and gone off somewhere. And there is a link here, there's a misunderstanding between the husband and Afsha's father. Anyway, there are this inclusion of women, because although the men are supposed to call the shots, they are barely visible. The entire story is within this interior of the house with the Dadi Alamara Begum ruling the roost. And here you see, well, I'll come to that later. Afsha is brought up by these women, grows up. Afsha's Pupi obviously has this son. The two children grow up together. And Afsha is a devoted little follower of Farrukh. Afsha is very fair, so is Farrukh very light-skinned. These are essentials. You can't have dark-skinned heroes or heroines. And Afsha is very beautiful, Farrukh is lively and mischievous and whatever. They grow up together, and then comes a time when there is this hidden dream of the mothers and the grandmothers and the grandfather that the two will make a match of it. It's not stated, it is there. The boy and girl obviously are going to make a match of it. It's a, it could be any Hindi, Pakistani film or any familiar story. Come puberty, the Dadi declares Parda. So this is where a bit of necessary narrative tension is introduced, because if there's nothing to impede the romance, then what's the point? Where's the wish fulfillment and the pleasure of resolution? Anyway, the story continues. Almost the boy and girl are separated due to parental misunderstandings and maneuverings of an aunt who wants Farrukh for her daughter, and ultimately the boy and girl get married. I mean, that is all there is to the story. The mystery of the mother is resolved, the missing uncle comes back, the estranged father is restored to the family, and Afsha and Farrukh have a baby boy. So everything, and the book ends with, I think it is, Afsha ने धानी रंग की सितारों वाली साड़ी पहनी हुई थी और हाथ में उसके गोद में काला था. So it's all happily ever after. But around it all, very interesting things are happening. For one thing, there's a certain intertextuality. You see the influences of Dr. Nazir Ahmed. And to go further afield of Mrs. Sarah M. Ellis of 19th century England, who wrote these tomes on the wives and daughters of England, which are, ethical and a combination of ethics and etiquette and good housekeeping, in which Sarah M. Ellis is more or less telling that even if your husband is talking nonsense, you never contradict him, because it's not for us to contradict these men. They work so hard outside. I mean, it can be read as a very subversive text, and I'm taking the mickey out of it a bit, but she writes very seriously. Alamara Begum is a mixture of that. She runs a beautiful house. She manages a very large family of daughters and sons-in-law and nieces and aunts, and the big house where the widowed aunts come in and the poorer relations also come in, and there is Muklani. Now, what is happening? The family is a Sayyid family, so caste is established. Sayyid Sahab, whose name I can't remember, is in government service with the British Raj. He has moved out of the inner city in Delhi into the suburban outskirts. So a bit of history, a bit of contemporaneity coming in and change. The house is divided it's still segregated in terms of male and female space, but the lines are more fluid. The boundaries in the house in Afsha are hidden boundaries or unstated boundaries. They are the boundaries of silence. What you may say, to whom in front of you, whom you can speak, what you can hear, what you can't hear, and this leads to a lot of other very interesting things, to which I hope I'll be able to come back later. But anyway, there is a Sayyid family. They are wealthy. The lack in Afsha's life, which is very clearly there in the absent mother in her own silence, is made up for through an excess of food. खाने पक रहे हैं, खजूरें दूध में डुबोएंगे तो ज़ाफ़रान की चुटकी डालेंगे और ये पुदीने का यूं करेंगे. It's one recipe upon the other, and it's very entertaining, I must say. It's fun. And Alamara Begum talking to her daughters and ticking them off and telling them how to behave and the do's and the don'ts. And then the gradations within. There is again the humor. Alamara Begum doesn't laugh very much. Humor, laughter is subversive, and she is a very properly behaved lady and in charge of this household. The only times she laughs are one at Farooq's mischief, when she's exasperated but also driven to laughter. And Farooq's idea of fun, incidentally, is quite crude. Like killing a sparrow and putting it in Afshan's trunk, or pulling her pigtail, or running off with her dupatta. I mean, it is attention, but there is a kind of implicit violence in it also, which is again interesting, because it is part of the discourse of love or romance. And there's Afshan weeping at the drop of a hat, but not uttering. But anyway, to come back to Alamara Begum, the only time she laughs are when fun is made of Moglani Begum, who is a servant in the house, obviously been there for years, and has the sensitivities or the touchiness of a dependent. But somehow the text is very insensitive to that. I mean, reading it against the grain one sees, or reading it from one's own perspective today, one says, what the hell? But Alamara Begum, or the narrative voice is very uncritical. The other person who is a source of humor is this Chachi Jan, who is again a widow, rather large, rather fat, gossip, indiscreet, and the text holds forth a lot through Alamara Begum's voice on the downside of gossip, buri baat. And Chachi Jan is the kind of woman which is rather funny. I mean, she's rather well drawn. Who will say कि Chachi Jan आप ये खाएंगे? कह रहे हम नहीं खाते, बस इतना सा खा दो. And that इतना सा then piles up to a huge amount on the plate. And the nieces and etc. are obviously having fun at her expense, and so is the writer, and so is the reader. But this plenitude, this excess, is somewhere countering the lack in the romance, in the love story, in Afshan's life, in the life of her puppy who waits silently for her husband who may or may not return, who never complains, of whose sorrow we are aware, but who never speaks of it herself. And for a novel to set in South Asia, in British India, or even in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh today, food is very important, given our own scarcities, given middle class, lower middle class readership. I think food, like children's stories, we used to love reading about midnight feasts, somewhere is part of very significant fantasy. Then clothes. Again, an emphasis, not as much as I assume there would be today in the romantic novel of today, because we are much more into consumerism. But wealth is there, established, unending, and making for security. This is so, and then there are the intertextuality of, as I said, of the Deputy Nazir Ahmed coming in, the morals that are being taught. So somewhere, if the romantic novel or the popular romance was a slightly suspect genre, and women reading or writing in any case were not looked upon with too much complacency by the general, generally at that time, then somewhere there seems to be a kind of an attempt at vindicating that kind of criticism also on the part of A.R. Khatun. It has been argued that the popular romance, or fantasy rather, not popular romance, does two things simultaneously, and that is happening here also. That it expresses desire, that articulates it, gives it expression, and then at the same time, at another level, expels it. and by diffusing it. And in the popular romance of the A.R. Khatun type, or even of the Mills and Boone type, or Razia Bhatt type, this is part of the strategy or the process. Because desire is expressed in the establishment of the love relationship, in the happy resolutionship of the love relationship, and in the other forms of wish fulfillment or plenitude that exist around the space, but it is expelled before it reaches the point when it can become subversive. Afsha can fall in love with Farooq, but it is justified by the fact that they have grown up together. Afsha may fall in love with Farooq and he will know that they are good people. So Afsha will never speak her love. It is there but never expressed. Her only form of expression is through her tears or through her skin, which becomes very pink, or when he comes or doesn't come or whatever, or somebody teases her. But she never once says anything. In fact, not too much directly to Farooq either. It's and Farooq's relationship with her is more of horseplay or teasing or indirect speech, where he will talk about her or address her through a cousin or the other. Like, there are some people who do this kind of thing, but he's talking to Afsha but not addressing her. So, morality is maintained, moral norms and spaces are maintained through that. Then the heavy moral line we get from Alamara Begum and the other ladies is again somewhere diffusing the fact that Afsha has of her own accord fallen in love with Farooq and he with her. And so that is one aspect. The other very interesting thing that is happening in this novel is the use of silence. Space is negotiable. There are multiple thresholds in this house. The actual thresholds where you don't go out when the grandfather is sitting with his male friends, then the women keep away. Or if there is a bake to be cooked outside, then the men or the boys in the house will look after that. It is inside the house that the women will see to the functioning of things, or in sending out the stuff. If they travel and so much elaichi and so much is sent in from outside, but then the men take over. So there is that actual physical division. Then there are divisions when, if elders are talking in a room, the younger people, certainly the women, or the more distant relations don't go there. And then there are the thresholds of speech and silence. Afsha cannot speak her love. Afsha's pupil never articulates her own sense of loss or the lack in her own life. She can only scold her son, that's about it. Even in front of her mother, she never says anything. Aramana Begum the Dadi, rules clearly. But when her husband is conversing with the gentleman in his room, she will not go and listen. She will not be part of that. But then how do they manage? They listen, they eavesdrop. And this reminds me of something in my own life. When I was a kid, ours was a nuclear family setup, but next door to us were my cousins, and theirs was more an extended family scene, and much more segregated the space was in terms of male-female mixing. Now, at home I was told eavesdropping is bad. I'd go over next door and I'd be sitting with my aunt, and her husband would come outside, and she would tell one of us kids, go and see what your uncle is saying, and come back and tell me. And I used to feel, my aunt is a good woman, my father tells me eavesdropping is bad, my aunt, who is his older sister, whom he respects, is telling me to go and eavesdrop, what the hell is happening? But I did. But the point is that if you have these barriers and boundaries, then how do you negotiate space? How do you survive? Survival then depends on eavesdropping, on innuendo, on oblique speech. And somewhere it brings us to the point where they say, women are clever or women manipulate. Well, the reality of women's spaces, the relationships, the social arrangements are such that Survival depends on them. And not only of the men, Farooq also eavesdrops. When his marriage is being decided, he's lying on the bed, pretending to be asleep in the next room, but listening in and hearing more than he would like to hear, and then the misunderstandings. The other thing about Afshan, which makes it interesting, and which is again part of the reality factor in the romance novel, is the part played by history. It has a very wide sweep. The book begins in Beirut with the birth of Afshan, whose mother is Lebanese, the daughter of a Jewish merchant who apparently dies at childbirth, and the father is turned out by his Jewish father-in-law, and he leaves with the child. That is all that we know. The brother-in-law, his sister's husband, is there, and he stays back, and hence the misunderstanding and the man not returning home. But how did these men get to Beirut in the first place? The Khilafat movement. The Khilafat movement took them there, and then they stayed on. They stayed on because they had offended the British Sarkar at home, and it was more or less a political escape. But unlike the realist novel, where these things would be foregrounded, history is the backdrop. It provides the material with which the story can move on. Because this is the source of later misunderstandings and mysteries. Apparently, Afshan was not the only sibling. There was a brother, they were twins. Only the father knows they were twins. The son is kept back, the daughter is sent with him, so there is gender politics. Because at one point the father says, "Ki mujhe kam keemati cheez de di." The less valuable thing was given to me. The son stays back. And hence the father's anger and estrangement with the daughter he does bring back. The father remarries. He remarries in Bombay. He meets this woman at the point when he returns from Beirut. He is distraught and disturbed. More or less. And is manipulated into this marriage by this, I think it is an Aga Sahab, who represents modernity in those times, in the sense that modernity is equated with the desire for material gain. He's very money-minded. His daughter is a widow. She has a child by an earlier marriage. She's again very fair-skinned and beautiful. And he manipulates these meetings between his family and this young man who's staying in the hotel. The child has been placed in the hospital for care. And the woman typically then expresses this great desire to see this little girl, love her, but once the marriage takes place, then the father persuades her, don't take on this problem, let him deposit her with his own family. So, and this other family represents a partly villainous dimension. Zartaj Begum, the second wife, coming from a different background, having different interests, is more interested in maneuvering a marriage between her daughter and Farooq rather than letting Afshan and Farooq get married. So that creates a bit of necessary romantic tension in the novel. Then at some point, the lost sibling returns, leading to yet more misunderstandings. Because Farooq at that point sees Afshan was moved to her father's house, sees her with this very good-looking young boy, and he sort of goes off in a huff, or somebody goes off in a huff. I don't know. I think it's Farooq. But on the other side, there is Farooq's own aunt, Nasina Begum, who again is a poorer branch of the family, with her eye on Farooq, who is going to inherit his grandfather's property. And the father turns up at the end, his property as well. So there are those manipulations and machinations to get him for her daughter. And somewhere the real action is happening around that. The love story of Afshan, Farooq is negligible and barely there. But I just feel that for us people, feminists, or anyone interested in bringing about social change, and that once again brings one back to feminism. I was trying to widen the base. it is important to read these romances, if not for anything else, to find out what people are dreaming about. Because in ignoring the level of fantasy, the dimension of fantasy, or trivializing it, somewhere we then fail to discover what people are dreaming of. And I think the reality of fantasy is as real as material reality is, or any other form of reality, because it does occupy a very important space in our lives. And I feel that the romance can be read and read against the grave to uncover so much that needs to be uncovered, to bring an understanding also, and also for fun. I mean, I'm not saying read Razia Bhatt, she is difficult, but something like this. Another example from another book of A.R. Khatun's is again talking about fulfillment, the rags to riches story of people having lost money in India, moving to Pakistan after partition, moving into homes left behind by departing Sikhs and Hindus, and accessing untold wealth. And it's again instant. It's a theme picked up very critically by Khadija Mastoor and Anand, because her whole disillusionment with the new country is built on this lost dream, where people immediately forget what they've talked about and start accumulating. In A.R. Khatun, it is not seen critically, it is seen as something very positive, that how wonderful this has happened. And I think it is these negative positives what realism might foreground, or what the recipes of writing might emphasize in one way, and the romance uses it in another way, which also opens up spaces for interesting readings. I think that's